Well, ISIS comes from a combination of some indigenous Iraqi forces with influence of radical jihadis that had experience in Afghanistan. But over time, it became a particularly Iraqi focus or Iraqi-based group before it started expanding. But the sources of ISIS power, or at least the center, the core interest of ISIS, is in the region of what we call Asham, including the Syria region and, of course, Iraq. But this is a primarily indigenous force that, of course, was affected significantly by events elsewhere, including the actions of the United States. But all those conspiracy theories that suggest something nefarious as if some other actors created ISIS are completely missing the point. ISIS was created by members of ISIS. These are not just incidents, these are signs that ISIS feels more confident and ready to move back to make some more bold moves. The question of the threat that it poses is a little bit more complicated, because first it constitute a significant threat to the people in the main regions in which it operates, which is in Syria and in Iraq. ISIS never really went away. The narratives that we heard in the last 3 years were just the easy sound bites for the media. They lost territory, they lost their leader, but that doesn't mean that the organization went away. They have many thousands of battle-hardened and ideologically motivated members. And whether these members are free or in prison, they are still committed to the cause. And given that the security condition in Syria and Iraq remains pretty concerning, I have to say, ISIS always has the reemergence potential. I think that we should see at least the attack on the prison through the lens of ISIS getting ready for making a comeback. The problem that ISIS will face is that the comeback that it's planning will not repeat the success that it had in 2014 when it stormed Mosul and took significant parts of Iraq before spreading even farther into Syria. Conditions on the ground today are much different. So ISIS still remains a threat, and definitely a threat to its surroundings. But ISIS' ability to actually repeat the horrific success that they had in 2014, 2015 is, we're just not there. ISIS is not that capable anymore, and the world is way more ready for any kind of moves by ISIS. I think that this is enough because the United States has a list of priorities, and ISIS does not appear at the top of those priorities, and it should not appear at the top of those priorities. I think that the American presence in Syria is very useful in keeping ISIS in check, but by itself, this is not enough. But this is also not just an American problem. And since much of the problem of ISIS depends on domestic conditions and domestic dynamics on which the United States clearly has very limited impact, then the United States is not supposed to be keeping the ISIS threat down all the time. The presence in Syria definitely helps in that regard. But as I said before, ISIS is also not the threat that it used to be 8 years ago. And the United States has other more urgent issues it needs to deal with. I don't think so, because the ideology of groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State reject any kind of peaceful coexistence with other states. It rejects even the formulation of what is a state and the responsibility between states. The caliphate cannot succeed in the current international structure. On the other hand, you see actors like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, used to be Jabhat al-Nusra, who did make the significant change in focusing on much more local issues and trying to create a small Islamic emirate um, in Syria, in a small territory. They are actually a much better reflection of the Taliban model than ISIS or Al Qaeda. In almost every place that ISIS and Al Qaeda operate, they are the foreigners. It's only in Iraq and to some extent in Syria that ISIS has some stronger indigenous roots rather than just groups that they co-opt. But even in those places, uh, if you will give the Sunni population an alternative, a Sunni alternative, ISIS will not be able to survive there. They are just not uh, very popular. Now, they do have significant number of forces and their families that are there. And so they are a force that will stay relevant for a while. But this is far from the aspirations that they have and the experience that actors in the region had with them make the ability of ISIS actually finding its space within the international community makes it highly unlikely. But again, as I said, ISIS is not looking for that kind of funding our own state, founding our own state, and one that might be an Islamic emirate, but will not cause problem to its neighbors. The Islamic State doesn't even accept the current borders of states. So any kind of success of the Islamic State inherently undermine international order and is leading to a backlash against the group. So the group can recover and have some uh, tactical success at some points and in some locations, but overall, their chances of repeating the success of 2014 are much slimmer. I don't think so because those countries are divided by so many different types of identities that it's just hard to see how that goes away. There will always be forces that remind Sunnis that they are Sunnis rather than Iraqi citizens. Uh, and so I think that this is a situation that will continue for a while, and we cannot try to create an alternative to ISIS by ourselves because we know that that kind of social engineering done by foreign actors without really understanding the local culture and local dynamics is just bound to fail and actually even backfiring. And so I think that the issue is whether there can be an indigenous Sunni force that will emerge, ideally a social movement that can bypass those boundaries between sects. But as we saw in Syria, uh, the efforts were remarkable, but the ability of stronger actors to destroy these efforts to bridge different kinds of identities, different ideologies, uh, this just didn't work in Syria. And we have no reason to expect that it will work now. It requires goodwill on behalf of all actors. You're not going to find that kind of goodwill. And especially while Assad is in power, I just don't see any kind of meaningful progress. So if we want to see the progress, I think we're going to have to wait for many years before the region perhaps comes out of its misery. Any kind of opposition to Assad these days had to rely on the goodwill of Turkey. But Turkish politics keep changing. Turkish interest in the region changing. Turkey is not doing anything out of its benevolent nature and sympathy to the Sunnis. It's very self-interested. When it is helping the Sunnis in Syria, it is often to serve its own interest. Its occupation of parts of Syria are not in order to prepare them to fight the regime, but they are a response to Turkish threat perception and the fear of the SDF, the Kurdish forces. And so ultimately, all the actors around are just pursuing their narrow self-interest. And for Turkey, it makes sense that its way into impacting the conflict just on its border is by allying with some Sunni forces. So they have a very important role in maintaining the control of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in an area of Syria. But I would not call Turkey the champion of the Sunnis. Ultimately, when Turkey decision makers decide that the national interest of Turkey requires sacrificing its proxies, it doesn't matter if those proxies are Sunnis, Turkey will sacrifice them. I think that if negotiations with Russia would put pressure on Turkey, or if it could get more of what it wants with regard to the Kurdic threat, it will be willing in return to make compromises at the expense of Sunnis in Syria. Ultimately, I just feel bad for the Syrian citizens that um, are just being played as pawns by many actors. Most of them are not even local actors. When local actors are involved, often they're pursuing also their own narrow interest with nobody really to care for the Syrian civilians. And that's the really sad thing, because it seemed like if 10 years ago somebody was at least interested in that suffering, these days this is seems like a status quo that the international community can live with.